Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty dense material. We're tackling Julius Evola, and specifically his book, Revolt Against the Modern World. From what I've seen in the excerpts our listener sent in, this is going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, Evola is, how should I put it? He's definitely a thinker who provokes, let's say, strong reactions. Italian intellectual, lived from 1898 to 1974, and his work continues to be influential, or at least it definitely continues to generate discussion. Revolt Against the Modern World, which he originally published in 1934, it's like his magnum opus. It's where he lays out his entire worldview.
And from what I've gathered, he covers a lot of ground: traditional society, spirituality, the problems of modernity, pretty much the whole shebang.
Right, yeah. He goes deep into how traditional societies function, what their spiritual underpinnings were, and then he contrasts that with what he saw as the decline of the modern world, the problems with modern values, that kind of thing.
And it looks like this book is divided into two main parts, right? The world of tradition and, what was it, Genesis and Face of the Modern World?
Exactly. So in this deep dive, we're going to be pulling from both of those sections. We'll try to give our listener a good overview of Evola's main ideas.
Sounds good. Well, why don't we just jump right in? Evola kicks things off by talking about this concept of tradition itself. What exactly does he mean by that?
So right from the start, in the world of tradition, Evola sets up this kind of fundamental distinction. He talks about what he calls the two natures of reality.
It's two natures.
Yeah, so there's like the physical world, the material stuff that we all see and interact with every day. But then beneath or beyond that, there's this other dimension, the metaphysical, the spiritual. And for Evola, this spiritual dimension, it's not just some abstract thing. It's like the real deal, the true source of everything. It's what gives the physical world meaning and purpose.
So he's saying that a purely materialist view of reality is missing something essential.
Exactly. For Evola, it's incomplete. It's like trying to understand the universe by only looking at the shadows on the wall. You're missing the real source of the light. And in the world of tradition, this spiritual aspect, it's not just some side note. It's the foundation of everything. It determines the way society is structured, the way people live their lives, everything.
So if this spiritual dimension is so central to traditional societies, how does that play out in their understanding of, say, leadership and authority?
Well, that's where Evola's concept of regality comes in. He sees traditional kingship as something completely different from how we think of political power today. It's not just about ruling over a territory or managing a state.
And more than that.
Much more. For Evola, the traditional king has this kind of sacred function. He's not just a political leader, he's also a spiritual authority. He's like a bridge between the human and the divine.
Or bridge.
Yeah, he uses this term pontifex. It's like the king's role is to ensure that the laws and the way society functions, it all aligns with this higher spiritual order. And there's this really interesting connection he draws between the king, the rex, and the sacred, the saucer. They're like intertwined in some way. The king embodies this sacred function.
Huh. That's a pretty different view from our modern secular understanding of political leaders.
Definitely. And then building on this idea, he introduces the concept of polar symbolism.
Polar symbolism, what's that about?
So Evola talks about this pole that exists in traditional societies. You can think of it as a kind of central axis, a focal point that everything revolves around. And it's not just a physical thing, like a literal pole or a central location. It's more like a symbolic representation of order, stability, and most importantly, justice. Yeah, but not just in the legal sense. It's more about this higher cosmic justice, the idea that everything in the world is in its rightful place, aligned with this divine order. And the king, or the ruler, their role is to uphold this sacred order, to be a lord of peace and justice.
So it's like their authority is rooted in something that goes beyond just human laws or political power.
Exactly. It comes from this transcendent source. And you see this idea of the pole manifesting in different ways in different cultures. Sometimes it's a sacred mountain or a temple or even just the central hearth in a village. But the point is, it's this symbol of a connection between the earthly and the divine.
That makes sense. So moving on from this idea of leadership, how does Evola view the traditional understanding of law and governance?
Well, for Evola traditional law, it wasn't just a bunch of rules that people made up. It was seen as an expression of this higher spiritual order we've been talking about. Like, the laws themselves were supposed to reflect these fundamental cosmic principles.
So it's like they were trying to align their earthly laws with some kind of divine law.
Exactly. And when he talks about the empire, he sees it as a form of political organization that's more in tune with this traditional worldview. The empire For him, it's not just about conquering territory or accumulating power. It's about embodying this universal sacred authority, bringing order and harmony to a vast domain.
And how does he contrast that with the modern state?
He's pretty critical of the modern state. He sees it as too materialistic, too focused on worldly power and economic interests. It's lost that connection to the spiritual dimension, that sense of a higher purpose.
So it's like it's become disconnected from its true source of legitimacy.
Exactly. And this is a recurring theme in Evola's work. This critique of the modern world is having lost its way, having abandoned these traditional principles.
That definitely seems to be a key element of his revolt. Now, he also talks a lot about rituals. What's the big deal with the mystery of the rite, as he puts it?
Well, for Evola, rituals weren't just empty ceremonies or social customs. They were seen as a way to actively connect with the sacred, to participate in maintaining this cosmic order.
Like they actually had power to influence things.
Exactly. He talks about their supernatural efficacy. It's like by performing these rituals in the right way with the right intention, you could actually tap into this spiritual power and bring about real change.
So they weren't just symbolic, they were actually meant to have a real impact on the world.
Right. And this ties back to that idea of the spiritual dimension being the true source of everything. By performing these rituals, you're essentially reaffirming that connection, aligning yourself with this higher power.
That's a fascinating perspective. Now, shifting gears a bit, Evola also talks about the patriarchal structure of traditional societies. What's his argument there?
This is where things get a little more controversial. Evola sees the patriarchate as a primordial and natural form of social organization. He argues that it's not just a product of culture or history, but it's actually rooted in these fundamental spiritual and even biological principles.
So he's saying there's something inherently different about men and women that makes the patriarchate the natural order of things.
That's essentially his argument. He sees men and women as having these distinct and complementary roles, and the patriarchal structure is just a reflection of that natural order.
That's definitely a view that's been challenged a lot in modern times.
For sure. It's important to remember that Evola was writing in a very different time and context. But even putting aside the contemporary debates about gender roles, it's interesting to see how he ties this idea of the patriarchate into his broader vision of traditional society.
It definitely fits with his emphasis on hierarchy and a divinely ordained social order. Now, he also talks about this concept of spiritual virility. What exactly does he mean by that?
This is a key concept for Evola. Spiritual virility, it's not just about physical strength or masculinity. It's more about this inner strength, this willpower, this ability to transcend your lower animalistic nature and connect with your higher spiritual self.
So it's like a kind of spiritual warrior ethos.
Exactly. It's about discipline, self-mastery, the ability to act decisively and courageously in accordance with these higher principles.
And he sees this as being essential for men in traditional society.
Right. It's like the ideal of the traditional man is someone who embodies this spiritual virility.
Yeah.
He's a warrior, a leader, a protector, someone who's able to uphold the values of tradition and defend it against threats.
Interesting. So moving on, he also touches on the afterlife. What are the two paths he describes in the traditional view?
So traditional societies often had this idea of different destinies in the afterlife, depending on how you live your life. It's not necessarily just a heaven and hell situation. It's more nuanced than that.
So like different levels or realms of existence after death.
Right. And the path you take depends on your actions, your spiritual development, how well you adhere to the principles of tradition. It reinforces this idea that your earthly life really matters, that it has consequences that extend beyond this physical realm.
That makes sense. Now, he also talks about civilizations going through this cyclical process of life and death. Could you unpack that idea for us?
Yeah, so Evola has this cyclical view of history. He draws on ancient ideas like the Hindu Yuga cycle. And basically, he sees civilizations as going through these distinct phases. There's a golden age, a time of spiritual vitality and high culture. But then there's a decline, a falling away from these traditional principles. And eventually, the civilization collapses and a new cycle begins.
So it's not a linear progression of progress. It's more like this recurring pattern of rise and fall.
Exactly. And he sees the modern world as being in this late stage of decline. We've lost our connection to the spiritual dimension, we've abandoned the traditional values, and as a result, our civilization is crumbling.
That's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is. But Evola also talks about the possibility of renewal, of a new golden age emerging from the ashes of the old. But that requires a conscious effort to reconnect with these traditional principles, to reject the decadence of the modern world, and rediscover this higher spiritual path.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not necessarily, but it's definitely a call to action, a challenge to wake up and realize what's been lost and what needs to be reclaimed.
That's a good segue into his discussion of initiation and conservation. What role do these processes play in his traditional framework?
So initiation for Evola, it's not just about becoming a member of a group or society. It's about this profound transformation, this awakening of your higher spiritual faculties. It's like a way to access this timeless wisdom, this connection to the sacred that's been passed down through generations.
And how does that tie into conservation?
Well, initiation is the means by which this traditional knowledge is preserved. It's like the guardians of tradition, the spiritual elite, they use these initiatory processes to ensure that this wisdom isn't lost, even as the surrounding civilization declines.
So it's like a way to keep the flame burning, even in the darkest of times.
Exactly. And Evola sees this as being crucial for the eventual renewal of civilization. It's like the seeds of a new golden age are being preserved through these initiatory lineages, waiting for the right time to sprout and grow.
That's a powerful image. Now, he also talks about the relationship between royalty and the priesthood. How does he envision that playing out in a traditional society?
So Evola sees royalty and the priesthood as representing these two complementary aspects of authority. Royalty, it's about temporal power, the king ruling over the earthly domain. But the priesthood, it's about spiritual authority, the connection to the divine.
So it's like a balance of power, each fulfilling their respective roles.
Right. And in an ideal traditional society, these two authorities work together harmoniously. The king rules in accordance with divine law, guided by the wisdom of the priesthood. And the priesthood, in turn, supports the king's authority and ensures that the spiritual dimension is always present in the way society functions.
So it's like a kind of sacred partnership working together to uphold the traditional order.
Exactly. And Evola sees this as being essential for a truly healthy and balanced society.
That makes sense. Now, he also brings up the idea of universality and centralism. What's he getting at there?
So this ties back to that idea of a transcendent truth that underlies all authentic traditions. Evola argues that there's this universal wisdom, this perennial philosophy that transcends specific cultures and historical periods.
So like a core set of principles that are true for all time and all places.
Exactly. And centralism, in this context, it's about the importance of having a centralized authority that embodies this universal truth. This could be a spiritual leader, a divinely sanctioned king, or even just a central location that's seen as a sacred center.
So it's like having a focal point, a source of unity and order for society.
Right, and Evola sees this as being essential for maintaining the integrity of tradition, for preventing it from becoming fragmented and diluted.
That makes sense. Now, shifting gears again, he also delves into the concept of chivalry. What's his take on the soul of chivalry, as he puts it?
So for Evola, chivalry is much more than just knights in shining armor and romantic ideals. It's about this spiritualized warrior ethos.
So it's about more than just fighting and bravery.
Definitely. It's about honor, loyalty, self-discipline, the unwavering defense of a higher order. It's about integrating physical strength with spiritual aspiration, using your power in service of something greater than yourself.
So it's like the ideal knight is a warrior, but he's also a spiritual seeker, someone who embodies these higher virtues.
Exactly. And Evola sees this as being a crucial element of the traditional worldview. The warrior, the hero, they play a vital role in upholding the cosmic order, in defending tradition against the forces of chaos and decline.
That's a fascinating perspective. Now, he also discusses the caste system. That's a topic that's obviously fraught with a lot of historical baggage. How does he approach it?
Yeah, this is definitely one of the more controversial aspects of Evola's work. He sees the traditional caste system in its ideal form as a natural and organic reflection of different spiritual aptitudes and social functions.
So he's not talking about the rigid and often oppressive systems that we associate with the caste system today.
Right. He's trying to get at what he sees as the original spiritual basis of the caste system. The idea is that different people have different inherent qualities and abilities, and the caste system is a way to organize society in a way that reflects these natural differences.
So like each caste has its own specific role to play in the overall functioning of society.
Exactly. And he sees this as being a more harmonious and balanced way of organizing society than the kind of egalitarian ideals that we have in the modern world.
That's definitely a perspective that's open to a lot of debate.
For sure. But it's important to try to understand Evola's arguments on their own terms, even if we ultimately disagree with them.
That's a fair point. Now, he also touches on professional associations, the arts, and even slavery. What are his main points in relation to these aspects of traditional society?
So, for Evola, everything in a traditional society is integrated into this broader spiritual order. Even things like professions in the arts, they're not seen as just secular pursuits. They have a connection to the sacred, they serve a higher purpose.
So it's like everything has its place in this divinely ordained cosmic order.
Exactly. And with regard to slavery, he tries to understand it within its historical and social context. He argues that in traditional societies, slavery wasn't always the brutal and dehumanizing system that we associate with it today.
So he's saying there were different forms of slavery, some of which were more benign than others?
That's his argument. He points to distinctions made in traditional thought between different types of servitude, but it's a complex issue, and obviously from a modern perspective, it's hard to see slavery as anything other than a horrific injustice.
Definitely. Now, moving on, he talks about this bipartition of the traditional spirit. What does he mean by that?
So Evola sees two complementary paths within the traditional worldview. One is the path of action, of engagement with the world. This is the path of the warrior, the ruler, the craftsman, the person who's actively participating in upholding the traditional order.
And the other path.
The other path is the path of renunciation, of asceticism. This is the path of the mystic, the monk, the person who withdraws from the world to focus on spiritual development.
So it's like two different ways of approaching the same ultimate goal.
Exactly. And Evola sees both paths as being valid and necessary. The active path is about maintaining order in the external world, while the contemplative path is about achieving inner liberation.
That makes sense. Now, he also talks about this concept of holy war. What's the distinction he draws between the greater and the lesser holy war?
So the greater holy war, for Evola, it's the internal struggle against your own lower nature. It's about conquering your ego, your passions, your attachments to the material world.
So it's like a spiritual battle, a fight for self-mastery.
Exactly. And then the lesser holy war, that's the external battle against the forces that are opposed to tradition.
Hmm.
This could be anything from actual warfare to cultural or political movements that are seen as undermining traditional values.
So it's like fighting on two fronts, both internally and externally, to defend and uphold the traditional order.
Right. And Evola sees both of these as being necessary. You can't have a true victory in the lesser holy war if you haven't achieved victory in the greater holy war.
That's a profound point. Now, he even talks about games and victory. What's the deeper significance he sees there?
So for Evola, traditional games and contests, they weren't just about entertainment or competition. They were seen as reflections of this cosmic order.
Like they had a symbolic meaning.
Exactly. They were a way to demonstrate not just physical prowess, but also spiritual qualities like discipline, courage, and the ability to overcome adversity.
So it's like they were training grounds for the virtues that were valued in traditional society.
Right. And victory in these contests, it wasn't just about personal glory. It was seen as a symbolic victory of order over chaos, of the higher spiritual forces prevailing over the lower animalistic impulses.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Now, he also discusses the traditional understanding of space, time, and the Earth itself. How does he view these fundamental aspects of existence?
So for Evola, space and time weren't just these abstract, objective dimensions. They had a qualitative, sacred dimension. Certain places were considered holy, certain times were considered auspicious.
So, like, the landscape itself was imbued with spiritual significance.
Exactly. And the Earth itself was seen as a living being, a sacred entity that needed to be respected and honored. It wasn't just a resource to be exploited.
That's definitely a different perspective from the modern view of nature as just something to be used for our own ends.
It is. And Evola sees this disconnect from nature as one of the major problems of the modern world. We've lost that sense of reverence for the natural world, that understanding of our place within the larger cosmic order.
That's a point that resonates even today with all the environmental challenges we're facing. Now, he also talks about the traditional view of man and woman. How does he present their respective roles and natures?
So Evola sees men and women as having these distinct and complementary roles, rooted in their inherent spiritual and biological differences. He often uses this language of solar and lunar principles.
So men are associated with the sun and women with the moon.
Right. And he sees this as being reflected in their respective roles in society. Men are the active, outward-facing principle, the warriors, the leaders, the providers. Women are the receptive, inward-facing principle, the nurturers, the caregivers, the keepers of the hearth.
And he sees these differences as being natural and harmonious.
Exactly. He argues that trying to erase these differences or force men and women into the same roles, it goes against the natural order of things.
That's definitely a view that's been challenged a lot in recent decades.
It has.
Uh,
And it's important to engage with these ideas critically and thoughtfully, considering the historical and cultural context in which they were written.
Absolutely. Now, finally, in this first part of the book, he talks about the decline of superior races. This is obviously a very sensitive topic. How does he approach it?
Yeah, this is where things get really tricky. Evola puts forth this theory of a decline in spiritual and even biological quality over time. He talks about how modern humans are a degeneration from these ancient, more spiritually advanced races.
So he's basically saying that humanity has devolved over time.
That's essentially his argument, and he ties this into his cyclical view of history, the idea that we're in this late stage of decline where everything is falling apart and degenerating.
And the superior races he refers to are those like the Aryan race that the Nazis talked about?
Well, it's complicated. Evola's views on race are complex and often contradictory. He was definitely influenced by some of the racial theories that were circulating in Europe at the time, but he also rejected some of the more extreme and explicitly racist ideologies like Nazism.
So it's a gray area.
It is. And it's important to be aware of the potential for these ideas to be misused and misinterpreted. But to understand Evola, you have to engage with his ideas on race, even if it's uncomfortable.
That's a good reminder to always approach these kinds of topics with critical thinking and a nuanced perspective. Okay, so that covers the first part of the book, The World of Tradition. Now let's move on to the second part, Genesis and Face of the Modern World, where he really digs into his critique of modernity. He starts by revisiting this idea of the four ages. How does he use that cyclical view of history in this context?
So remember that Hindu Yuga cycle we talked about? The Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, or Kali Yuga.
Yeah, the ages of decline.
Exactly. Well, Evola sees the modern world as being squarely in the Kali Yuga, the darkest of the ages. He sees it as a time of spiritual ignorance, materialism, social chaos, and the triumph of everything that's opposed to tradition.
So it's like we're at the bottom of the barrel, spiritually speaking.
That's essentially his view. And he uses this framework of the four ages to explain how we got here, how we fell so far from this primordial state of grace.
That makes sense. And he also goes back to this idea of the Golden Age. What does he say about that primordial era?
So for Evola, the Golden Age was a time of spiritual enlightenment, heroic virtue, and a harmonious social order. People lived in accordance with nature and the divine, and there was a sense of sacredness in everything they did.
Sounds pretty idyllic.
It does, but it's important to remember that this is an idealized vision of the past. It's not necessarily meant to be taken literally. It's more like an archetype, a symbol of what's been lost and what needs to be reclaimed.
So it's like a yardstick against which he measures the modern world and finds it wanting.
Exactly. And he sees the modern world as a complete inversion of this golden age. We've turned our backs on the spiritual, we've embraced materialism and individualism, and we've lost our connection to the sacred.
And this is all part of this cyclical process of decline that he talks about.
Right. He sees the modern world as the culmination of this long process of degeneration, this falling away from the primordial tradition.
That's a pretty bleak assessment.
It is. But Evola also talks about the possibility of a reversal, of a new cycle beginning. But it requires a radical transformation, a conscious rejection of the modern world, and a return to these traditional principles.
So it's not all hopeless.
Not necessarily,
Yeah.
but it definitely requires a lot of work, both individually and collectively, to overcome the inertia of the modern world and create something new.
That's a good reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always the potential for change and renewal. Now, he also goes back to this idea of the pole and the Hyperborean region. What's the significance of that in the context of the modern world's genesis?
So remember we talked about that symbolic pole in traditional societies, that center of spiritual authority and order.
Yeah, the axis mundi, the connection between heaven and earth.
Exactly. Well, Evola sees this pole as having been located in this mythical Hyperborean region in the far north.
Hyperborea, like a lost continent or something.
It's more like a symbolic realm, a place of spiritual purity and primordial wisdom. And Evola argues that as humanity migrated away from this Hyperborean center, they gradually lost touch with this spiritual source.
So it's like the further we moved away from the center, the more we fell into decline and decadence.
That's his basic idea. And he sees the modern world as being the furthest point from this Hyperborean origin, the point of maximum spiritual darkness and materiality.
That's a fascinating image. And he also introduces this concept of the Northern Atlantic cycle. What's that about?
So Evola sees this specific spiritual and cultural lineage that originated in the North Atlantic region. He connects it to this Hyperborean center, and he argues that it played a key role in the development of Western civilization.
So, like a particular strain of tradition that emerged in the West.
Exactly. And he sees the decline of this Northern Atlantic cycle as being a major factor in the rise of the modern world and its problems.
Interesting. And he also draws a contrast between North and South. What's that distinction about?
So Evola often makes these broad generalizations about different spiritual orientations. He associates the North with more virile, warlike, and spiritually oriented cultures. And he contrasts that with the South, which he sees as more passive, feminine, and focused on material pleasures.
So it's like a kind of yin and yang of spiritualities.
You would say that.
Yeah.
And he generally sees the northern spirituality as being closer to the primordial tradition, the original source of wisdom and power.
That makes sense, given his emphasis on spiritual virility and the warrior ethos. Now, he also talks about this civilization of the mother. What's that all about?
So the civilization of the mother, it's Evola's term for these early agricultural societies that he associates with feminine principles, fertility cults, and earth-based spirituality.
So it's like a more primal form of religion, focused on the natural world.
Exactly. And he sees it as being a necessary stage in human development, but ultimately something that needs to be transcended.
Transcend.
Yeah, he argues that the civilization of the mother is too focused on the material, on the cyclical rhythms of nature. It doesn't have that transcendent spiritual dimension that he sees as essential for true human flourishing.
So it's like it's a stepping stone, but not the final destination.
Right. And he sees the modern world as being in danger of regressing back to this earlier stage of development, of losing that hard-won spiritual awareness that characterized the higher forms of tradition.
That's an interesting perspective. Now, he also talks about these cycles of decadence and the heroic cycle. How do those fit into his overall narrative?
So as we've discussed, Evola sees history as cyclical, and he sees these recurring patterns of decline and renewal. The cycles of decadence, those are the periods where society is falling away from the traditional principles, becoming more materialistic, more individualistic, more focused on the gratification of the lower self.
And the heroic cycle.
The heroic cycle is the counter-movement. It's when individuals and groups emerge who are trying to resist this decline, to reconnect with the lost tradition and restore a higher spiritual order.
So it's like a kind of spiritual resistance movement.
Exactly. And Evola sees these heroic cycles as being essential for preventing the complete collapse of civilization. They're like the sparks that keep the flame of tradition alive, even in the darkest of times.
That's a powerful image. And he also clearly defines tradition and anti-tradition. What's the distinction he draws there?
This is really the core of Evola's worldview. Tradition, for him, it's not just about customs or rituals or old ways of doing things. It's about this perennial wisdom, this timeless body of spiritual principles and metaphysical truths that have been revealed to humanity throughout history.
And anti-tradition.
Anti-tradition is everything that opposes this. It's the forces of materialism, individualism, egalitarianism, everything that seeks to undermine the hierarchical order and spiritual foundations of traditional society.
So it's like the ultimate battle between good and evil, but on a cosmic scale.
You could say that. And Evola sees the modern world as being dominated by anti-tradition. We've turned our backs on the spiritual, we've embraced the values of the material world, and as a result, we're reaping the consequences.
That's a pretty stark assessment of the modern condition.
It is. But it's important to remember that Evola was writing in a time of great upheaval and uncertainty. The world was recovering from a devastating war, traditional values were being challenged, and there was a sense that civilization itself was at a crossroads.
That makes sense. So, given that context, it's understandable why he felt the need to mount such a forceful critique of modernity. Now, he also talks about this Hermetic Uranian Western cycle. What's that all about?
So this is where Evola gets into some pretty esoteric territory. He draws on Hermeticism, which is this ancient tradition of mystical philosophy and alchemy.
Alchemy, like turning lead into gold.
Yeah. But it's more than just that. It's about spiritual transformation, about perfecting the human soul. And Evola sees Hermeticism as being one of the main carriers of tradition in the West.
And what about the Uranian aspect?
Uranian refers to Uranus, the sky god, and it symbolizes this higher transcendent dimension. So the Hermetic Uranian cycle is basically Evola's way of understanding the spiritual history of the West, the way that tradition has been preserved and transmitted through these esoteric lineages.
That's fascinating. And he then provides a synopsis of this whole cyclical framework. Could you give us a brief overview of that?
Sure. So basically, Evola sees history as this grand drama of spiritual decline and potential renewal. We start in the Golden Age, this primordial state of perfection. But then we fall away from that, gradually descending through the ages until we reach the Kali Yuga, the darkest of the ages, which is where we are now.
And what happens at the end of the Kali Yuga?
Well, Evola is a little vague on the specifics, but he suggests that there will be some kind of cataclysm, some kind of breakdown of the old order, and from that chaos, a new cycle will emerge, hopefully a new golden age.
So it's like a kind of cosmic reset button.
You could say that. And Evola sees the possibility for individuals and groups to play a role in shaping this new cycle, to help steer it in a more traditional direction.
That's a hopeful note. Now, he also looks back at the Holy Roman Empire and the Ghibelline Middle Ages. Why does he have such a positive view of that period?
So Evola sees the Holy Roman Empire as a kind of last gasp of traditional authority in the West. He particularly admires the Ghibellines, who were the faction that supported the emperor's power against the papacy.
So he sees them as upholding the temporal power against the encroachments of the church.
Exactly. And he sees the Ghibelline ideal of a universal empire as being in line with the traditional principles of hierarchy, order, and centralized authority.
So it's like a glimpse of what a truly traditional society could look like.
Right. And he contrasts that with the decline of the medieval world and the rise of nation-states, which he sees as a further fragmentation of authority and a move away from traditional values.
That makes sense. So he's basically tracing this decline of tradition through